My name is Tammy Jae, and I live in the Port Huron, Michigan area. The story that we're going to hear today is about emotional abuse, physical abuse, and domestic violence, and how I turned pain into purpose. I was the youngest. I was the only grandchild at the time. And because I was living with my grandmother, because of the adoption situation with my mother, and my grandmother took on full custody of me, she had 8 children. And so I was the youngest. And so it was a lot of commotion because all of her children were pretty much adults. And it was a lot of tension in the home. And it wasn't a lot of I love you. It was almost like I was overlooked, kind of like I was a puzzle but didn't belong in that. I was a piece of a puzzle, but I didn't belong. The reason why I was raised by my grandmother, because my mother was a teenage mother and she signed adoption papers at birth. And when my grandmother got the call that I was placed up for adoption, my grandmother came and took custody of me. Well, at the age of 5 years old, my mother came back around, and at this time she had a new baby, and my grandparents purchased a house across the street, and my mother moved into the home. And I believe at that time my grandmother, she was older and she couldn't really care for me the way that a 5-year-old needs to be cared for. And so I ended up moving in with my mother, and that was the worst day of my life, and that is when a lot of my troubles began. So my mother fiance, he was in the military or army at that time, and he came home, and everyone was just kind of like he was the Prince Charming because he was in the military, and he was just loved by everyone. And that's when the abuse started. At the age of 5 years old, when the abuse started, it began by him showing me and magazines, and he would show me different, you know, positions in the magazines, and this is what children should do, and this is what your mother does to me. He groomed me for about 2 months. But not only was he grooming me, he knew the relationship between my mother and I. And so he would add on to that. Well, your mother doesn't like you. If you tell your mother, she's going to beat you. And at that time, he was also physically abusive to my mother. And so he would tell me, well, if you tell your mother, I'm going to beat her. So in my mind, I was afraid. Even though I had that hatred feeling for my mother, I still did not want to see her, physically abused. But one day I did get the courage to tell my grandmother when I was visiting, because my grandmother had been in and out of the hospital. And so one time when I went over to visit her, I said, Granny, he been touching me. And my grandmother responded, where? And I showed her what he had been doing. And my grandmother's exact words were, if he ever do it again, let me know. And so the molestation went on from the age of 5 years old to 10 years old. But in between that time, he had turned, it was so much tension in the household with him telling my mother that I was doing things to get my mother angry at me. And so that's when the physical abuse with her, because I guess she was trying to please him. So in return, I was punished for the things that he was saying that I was doing. He would touch my area. He would make me play with his, and and as I got older, he would lay on top of me and hump, until he, released. And the older I got, the worse it got, because like I said, it went from just a hand touching to his actual touching me. And he would do it every night. By the time I turned 10 and I'm going to school, I'm going into puberty and everything, and I'm seeing, and I actually saw this film at school on puberty about, menstruation for girls and how you can become pregnant. And I'm like, oh no, and I realized that I had to do something to make him stop. I was smart enough to know that I didn't want to get pregnant only because of the film that I saw in school. Because during that time, there wasn't any education classes on wrong touches, right touches. So I really didn't know. When I told my mother, I was 13 at that time. And the reason why I told her, because when he stopped at the age of 10, So he stopped touching me at the age of 10 because a lot of times when he would physically abuse my mother, she would say, I'm going to get my brothers. And I would see him just pack and run out of the house. So one day he came into my room and he was ready. And I said, if you ever touch me again, I'm going to tell my uncles. And that was the day that he packed up and he moved out. But I still got, my mother didn't know why. And so when she would come into the room, like ready to whoop me or whatever, I began to put on 3 pairs of pants, 4 shirts. I started preparing myself for the beating. So they, so the clothes would kind of like don't have such a hard impact. So he moved out at the age of 10. So for about, I don't know if my mother was still seeing him or not, but he moved back in with us at the age when I was 13 years old. He would make up all type of lies about different things that I had done while she was at work. And her way of pleasing him was to punish me. And he would tell me, well, if you ever tell your mother, I'm going to beat her. That was his exact words all the time. If you tell, I'm going to beat her. When I was 13 and he had moved back in with us, and he came inside of my room in the middle of the night. And by that time, I'm 13. I'd, been seeing some stuff. I'm angry. I'm just full of anger. And I told him to get the F out of my room. And he bet not ever come back in my room, because if he did, I was going to kill him. That's how just angry and frustrated I was. And so he went downstairs he went downstairs, but I can tell that he wanted to get my mother to come against me again. And he was telling my mother about something that I had did prior to that day. And I said, well, why are you telling her that? Tell her how you was molesting me from the time I was 5 years old to 10 years old. And my mother was pregnant at the time. And I remember her just running out of the home, and he ran behind her. And I'm sitting on the couch because I'm excited. I'm like, he's finally going to jail. It's finally out. I just felt like a relief. I just felt so relieved that I was finally able to tell my mother, and they came back in the house together. My mother walk through the door, and he walked in behind her, and there was no police. And that was the end of the story. So what that prompted me to just go to the streets. And so I started skipping school. I started being promiscuous. It was just a lot. And then I ended up becoming pregnant. So by the age of 14 and a half years old, I was pregnant. And that was also a terrible time in my life, because every day I had to hear, you're pregnant by my boyfriend. And she would tell me, well, she wanted me to get an abortion, and she took me to the abortion clinic, but I was too far along to get an abortion. And so I was probably about 6 months when I finally told my mother that I was pregnant. But every day for the next 3 months, I had to hear that I was pregnant by him. At the age of 14, I had my son, and he was the best thing that could have happened to me, because he saved me from the streets. Before I knew I was pregnant, I was really out there. I didn't want to live. Even when I was pregnant, and my mother, if I walked by, she would kick me or she would throw things at me, and just constantly hearing every day that the man that molested me for 5 years was my child's father. It was no more that she could done to me at that point. And so I remember just taking a bunch of pills, because I said I didn't want to live there. I didn't want to live in that situation anymore. And I really did not want to bring a child into that environment. And I just remember taking the pills and just going to sleep and praying. I was like, God, I just don't want to be here anymore. And I remember just waking up and just vomiting. He never paid for the things that he did. But about a month ago, I wrote him a letter. I found him on Facebook, and I wrote him a letter. And I actually reminded him of all the things that he did to me and how he took my childhood away from me. Because I feel like no child should never experience, molestation. And, he molested me when I would go, he would take me to school every morning. And he would put his hands in my pants while he was driving. I was being molested on the way to school. And so no child should ever have to go through anything like that. At the age of 15, I ended up leaving my mother's home. because she, like I said, she was physically abusive. And at that time, she was still being physically abusive, even with me having a child. And so at that point, I felt like, I'm too old to still be getting whoopings. Okay. And so I left and I moved with my grandmother. And I bounced from my grandmother to my aunts, from my aunts to my, grandmother. It was very unstable. And by when I turned 18, we got our first apartment. And I went back to school. I started doing things to better my life for my son. And on my way, I ended up getting this job. I was doing some training as a counselor, abuse counselor, actually. And I met this guy, and he would always kind of follow me home. Nice. I wasn't looking for no dating. I had dealt with enough, okay? And so I wasn't, but I thought he was a friend. And so one day, he just moved in, I seen him coming through my front door with his clothes. And I want to say this. I know people would say, well, why you didn't tell him to get out? Because he was another groomer. He would tell me about how he would beat people and so he was putting fear inside of me all of that time with him being my friend by telling me those stories of different things that he had did to people. So when he came through my front door with all of his clothes, I was too afraid to tell him to leave. He would force me, and I would say force because I didn't want to have sex with him because I didn't want to be with him that way. And he would force me to have. And if I did want to have, then that's when it went from a punch in the eye. If I refused, he would tie me up, so the abuse just went on. And not only did he physically abuse me, he would take the money, he would take the groceries out of the refrigerator. And, by the time he would do those things to me and I called the police, he would be long gone by the time the police got there. And so this went on from the age of 18 to 25 years old. Between 2 to 3 times a year, I was moving to get away from him. And I would come back home and he would be sitting in my living room. I did not know how he was finding out where I was living. And later on, I learned that my mother's fiance at that time personally knew him and was giving him my location every time I moved. It was one time he beat me so bad in front of my mother, and she was in the backyard with us, and he beat me so bad, stumped me, kicked me. And her fiance at the time was telling her not to get involved. She did try to stop him, but her fiance kept saying, don't get involved. That was between them. And the only reason why her fiance did stop him is because he picked up a shovel and he was about to beat me with the shovel. And when I seen the shovel coming, it was like I just passed out and I woke up in the hospital and I had a concussion and bruises and just all of that. By the time I turned 19, because I had experienced so much trauma and so much inner pain was going on. At that time, my son was about 5 years old, and here I am because I was being, and at that time I didn't think it was rape. It never crossed my mind that I was actually being raped inside my own home, and I found out that I was pregnant, and there was no way that I wanted a child by this man. And I went and I got an abortion. But even though an abortion is painful, it was like I felt a release of pain. And I got pregnant again. And I went and got another abortion. I got pregnant again. And I went and got another abortion. It was like I was beginning to get addicted to abortions. And I know a lot of people may be like, is against abortions, but at that time it was like my mind was so messed up, and I was looking for a way to escape pain by receiving pain. And then I started getting tattoos. I would go into the tattoo shop and I would ask the tattoo artist, what place on your body hurts the worst? And he told me your neck, your shoulder, the top of your feet. And that's the places where I would get a tattoo. And it was like when I would just hear that drilling and that, it was like it was releasing pain. I didn't feel the pain from the needle, because I felt inner pain being released. At the age of about 35, I would say, I was in my mid 30s, and it was Christmas time, and someone gave my children a present. A neighbor gave my children a present, and they was excited. They was opening up the present, and it was an operation game. And that operation game just took me back. It opened a closet with so many skeletons that now I had to deal with the molestation, because I had a operation game when I was 10 years old, during the time when I was being molested. So to see this game, it was like a trigger for me. I could not even allow the game to stay in the house. I threw the game away because it just reminded me of everything. So I would put my children to bed, and I didn't know what to do. I never had therapy for any of the abuse. And I went to go see a therapy. And I didn't want to talk to a woman therapist, because at that point, I really didn't even like women. I didn't like women, and I didn't like men, okay? And I said, but you know what? I would prefer to talk to a man about what I was going on. I think I didn't like women because of my mother. I didn't like men because of her fiance. But yet I was still afraid to talk, because even when I was growing up, it was always shut up, don't talk. And so I never looked eye to eye with anyone. I was always looking down when I was talking. I would talk, and I was afraid to speak. I was very withdrawn, shy, all of that. And so I asked my therapist, I said, well, can I just write you a letter every week to tell my story? And he was like, sure. So I went and I bought me a journal. And so I just began to write my story from the beginning to the end. A lot of pages I cried on. I tore them up. And so the more I began to write and just release a lot of that, the more I started feeling some healing, some therapy was going on. And I felt more open to talk about my story and share different things that I was going through. And so by the time I got to the end of my story, my therapy was over because I was healed. Now it's like to the point, okay, now what can I do to be able to help other people that is going through the same or been through the same thing? And so I began to publish. I remember my sister was coming over, and she saw my notebook, and she looked at it, and she said, this is a book. You should write a book. And I never thought about writing a book. And so I turned my journal into my biography, so that I can help others heal from their stories, to be able to feel free. Because once you tell your story, it's like a freedom takes place. I dealt with rejection. I dealt with abandonment because I felt like my mother didn't love me the way she loved her other children. I felt rejected by my mother. I felt rejected by my grandmother because she didn't help me. I had a lot of unforgiveness. I had a lot of bitterness toward the man that, molested me, towards the man that assaulted me. So it was just so many emotions that I had built up inside of me. But when I began to write, and knowing that my writing just wasn't about me, but now I have to learn, I have to be in a place where I can help others. And so now I'm a publisher. And a lot of the books that I have published is about men and women telling their stories about abuse. And it's been a beautiful thing, and it's like a lot of times they're afraid to tell their stories, or a lot of times because the backlash from the family, especially if it's someone in the family or someone that the family knows. No, it's almost like whatever happens in the house, growing up in my era, whatever happens in the house stays in the house. So no one told, but now this cycle has to be broken. It's time to tell.